It's a true story, actually, of a fellow who was a convict. He was a convict, and he got life imprisonment, but he was the model convict. He was being held in a prison just off the south coast of Australia. So it's quite an isolated area. Let me just push this door over. So it's quite an isolated area. And he just got on with it. Got on with life, being a convict there, sitting out his time, until one day, out of the blue, completely to the shock of the prison guards, etc. I hope a baby wasn't in there. There wasn't a baby in that, was there, Rach? Well, there's a small mercy. Yeah, happy birthday. You're not going to be a spy, are you, really? Brilliant, where were we? Okay, right, out of the blue, this perfect prisoner, if it's possible to be that, went out one day and committed a violent and bloody murder of another one of the convicts in the prison. He was restrained, he was pinned down, and he was shipped off to the mainland for a trial for murder. And at the trial, he gave the account, and there was no denial of what he'd done. He was quite honest about it. I slaughtered that guy. There was no sense of remorse, and to be honest with you, the judge was totally bewildered. And he said to him, look, why have you done this? Why on earth, with no motive, what on earth was the reason, out of the blue, you killing like that? The convict replied, well, you see, it's a bit like this, Judge. I was sick of life, and so I figured I'd get you lot to hang me. Well, in that case, said the judge, why be so daft? Why murder? Why not throw yourself into the ocean? Why don't you try and hang yourself? Why don't you stab yourself in the head with a fork? Why did you have to go and kill that guy? Ah, said the convict. You see, I'm a good religious churchgoer. My church tells me that if I commit suicide, then I will go straight to hell. So I figured that if I murdered someone, I can confess my sins to the priest before I die, and that way God will forgive me. So my question to you is, was he right? Is God fooled by that kind of logic? There's that kind of religious mindset that says, if I jump through the right hoops, no matter how I live, then at least I'm in. Is God fooled by that? Okay, let's start lower down than God. Are you fooled by that? What makes you think God's going to be fooled by it then? And yet some people think and cling to religion. Religion, they think, has this wonderful way of just making sure I'm in and I'm safe before God, no matter how I behave, no matter what my life looks like. And that poor guy, you could almost see the blindness, couldn't you? He was nuts. But religion has this way of blinding you and deceiving you into thinking that you are safe. In fact, I just want to say that religion, and you know it because I speak about it enough, religion is profoundly dangerous. I'm not surprised that so many people in our government at the moment are hostile towards religion. I think we should be hostile towards religion. I think it should carry a government health warning. I do think that religion should be banned, both inside and outside, even more banned than smoking. Because religion has the power to deceive us so that we put our confidence in outward things, outward knowledge, jumping through the right hoops, or else outward knowledge, religious practice, or even a simple certificate that we got when we were 6. I'm okay before God. But the question is, do we think that God is really fooled? I wouldn't want to worship a God who's fooled by that, would you? Now, over the last 2 weeks, you'll know there's been a bit of a bumpy ride here on Sunday mornings, hasn't it? Because as we go through those first early chapters of the book of Romans, we're almost glad that we haven't brought our friends along to here. See, I'll bring them to the good news about Jesus being forgiving and all of that sort of thing. But this bad news about how bad we are, well, I want to keep that one quiet. And Paul isn't ashamed of that. In fact, he says that one of the reasons you don't need to be ashamed of this message is because of how serious your problem is. And only when you realize how serious the problem is will you run for your only hope. And I suppose really I could suggest that Romans chapters 1 and 2 really are all about what kind of bouquet of flowers you need. And if you were in my fellowship group the other night, you'll know what I'm getting at. You'll know about a bouquet of flowers. Fellas, when do we buy a bouquet of flowers for the missus? Don't say Valentine's Day, birthdays, Mother's Day, because that's not what I'm talking about. When is it that we buy a bouquet of flowers for the missus? Oh yes. When we have invited, welcomed and encouraged, when we have encouraged their wrath. Perhaps it is that you promised you'd be back home at 6 and you didn't come in until 7 and you know full well it was your fault. What do you pull out as you walk in the door to pacify and calm down? Cost you to try this once in a while, mate. Make such a world difference in your house. You pull out, well, they're not that important. It wasn't that big a misdemeanor, so you pull out carnations. Okay? You admit that you do something a little bit worse than that. In fact, it's getting pretty serious. And you've been being made known about this, and you know that she is not happy, and rightly so. And so carnations won't cut it. So you come in one night, and it's sort of 6 dozen red roses. Maybe that is enough to fend off the wrath and the anger that you are facing. Maybe it gets even worse than that. You have to chuck in a week at Disneyland or sort of a romantic weekend in Paris or something like that. Something that will buy it off. But something tells me that if you were to walk into your missus carrying carnations, even 6 dozen red roses and a trip to Rome, and say, I'm sorry, love, but I slept with the woman next door, do you think that would cut it? Do you think that would turn away the rightful, jealous wrath at your unfaithfulness and your betrayal of trust, your breaking of the relationship? Would it? It wouldn't, would it? So what Paul is doing here is he is saying that we are all the people who slept with the woman next door. We have all suppressed the truth about God. We've set out our lives and we have given our love that should have gone to him to stupid little things in our life. Like shiny things we put on our fingers. Like the door plaque that you put on your office. Like the state of our house. That's where we've invested our love and left God to get the titbits on a couple of mornings a week if he's lucky. Do you really think that anything we can do is going to fend, a bouquet of flowers will fend it off? Well, apparently Paul thinks there are people out there who think there are. And we've met them last week. You saw it was the first half of chapter 2. It was the moral, upright person. Let me call him Mickey Moral. He says, yes, you lot out there, you bad people who've ignored God, not done right, you deserve God's judgment. Well, for me, I've lived a particularly moral and upright and good life. And Paul says, excuse me, mate, you're in just as much trouble. And I'll tell you why. In fact, it was Francis Schaeffer who gave this illustration. He used the illustration of an invisible tape recorder. And this invisible tape recorder, you could tell it's from the 1970s, it would be an MP3 or an iPod or something nowadays, but it's a tape recorder from back there. And he's speaking to the person who, they imagine themselves standing before God, and when God says, well, what did you do with the grace I gave you? He says, well, don't blame me. You know, you can't hold anything against me. You can't hold me responsible. I never knew you. I never knew what your standards were. I'd never heard of Jesus. How can I know? How can you judge me? I'm in the clear. I've been moral as best I knew. And because God is a fair and just judge, he takes out the invisible tape recorder hanging around this guy's neck and says, because I'm the fairest judge around you, I won't judge you by what you don't know, but I will judge you by your words. I will judge you by what you have said and done. This magic invisible tape recorder only went on and pressed record when you said, you should, or you ought. It only recorded your standards that you try to impose on other people. You will be judged by your standards that you have condemned other people by. And immediately we begin to sweat, don't we? Because we have all lambasted and criticised other people, and then only a moment later done exactly the same thing wrong. So I think of the lady who's a former colleague of mine. She was furious when she came storming into the classroom, into the staff room. How dare, where is what's her name? How dare she talk about me behind my back in front of everybody? It's terrible. I would never do that in front of the whole staff room. And we're guilty, aren't we? So Paul has dealt with the moral person, Mickey Moral person. Here we are. We've next got the religious. So I suppose this is Ricky, religious. This is the one we're coming on to. I thought Matthew'd like those names. He doesn't like them, but not a problem, okay? What bouquet is he going to try and present to God as a way of saying, I don't have to face your anger. I'm in the clear. I'm safe. I can be confident. I can be sure. And the answer is religion. It's worth me saying at this point, Paul isn't trying to offend everybody, but he is. He's trying to lead us all, saying there's no excuse before God's bar of judgment. You bad people out there, you're lost. You good people out there, spiritually, you're lost. You religious people out there, spiritually, you are lost. You haven't got a leg to stand on. You, politely speaking, are stuffed. And it's one of the hardest ones to crack if you're a religious person, isn't it? Because religion has a blinding effect. Please listen, because you will be tempted to take refuge in your religion. And the refuge that we are tempted to take in our religion is utterly futile. Now, I'm talking to religious people just by virtue of the fact you're sitting in a pew. There will be a temptation for you and me to try and hide behind this one. Now, religion can no more protect us from the wrath of God than Hannah Montana wig can protect us from a slab of concrete falling on our head. Religion can't do that. It is flimsy, broken, and can do nothing, yet we try it. Let me show you how. Let me test it on you now. Think to yourself and be honest. I'm not wishing you to die tonight, but if you were to die tonight, think now, what would you feel pulled towards to rely on as your hope before God, as your reason that you should be okay? Now perhaps up here you know the answers, but in here, what are you pulled towards and think, well, that must surely count for something before God? Maybe it is the moral stuff, like I'm a good person, I don't steal, I'm not a mank, I'm honest, I'm not a dentist, I give to charity, I pay my taxes, I help give people lifts to church. Surely that's got to count for something. No. But what about your religious stuff? I go to church. I'm one of the longest standing members at Speak Baptist Church, don't you know? It's not just any church. I've been baptised properly. I've had my first communion. I've got a Bible and I've even read it. I went to a faith school. Surely that must count for something before the bar of God. And if you feel your heart drawn to any of those as something you might try and grab a hold of before the bar of God's justice, and that's the sign that you have got to listen to what we're saying here. Because we will scratch around for anything with which to find confidence in. Here's two reasons that Paul gives us in this chapter, and I'll be as quick as I can because I assured Alan we wouldn't leave the kids out there too long given we've got communion. There are two reasons in this passage here as to why religion just will not help. We got it up here? Here we go, you can see them there. The first one is merely knowing about God won't help, and secondly, merely an outward sign won't help at all. So look down at, will you back over the page at verse 17. Now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and brag about your relationship to God, if you know His will and approve of what is superior because you're instructed by the law, if you are convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of infants, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. If all that, then we'll come to the next bit in a second. You here are meeting a people of privilege. The Jewish nation. Father Abraham was called nearly 2,000 years ago, and God made the promise that through him blessing would come to all the world. That's the storyline of the Bible. God draws a line in the sand and says, the brokenness I am going to work towards bringing to an end, and it will come through somebody in your family, Abraham. And so the Jewish people were vastly privileged because they got given God's law. Now when you think of law, you think of you shall not do this, you shall not do this, you shall not do this. But God's law was so much more than merely a rule book. It wasn't a rule book. It taught of life in a trusting, loving relationship with and reliance on Him. It provided within the law ways back to God when you failed. It targeted the heart. It wasn't just outward things, it was inward things. John, are you able to settle down for me, mate? Brilliant, thank you. And most of all, the law showed God's people what God was like. It wasn't like God was sitting up in heaven one day saying, to steal or not to steal? Steal, not steal. Not steal. God wasn't sitting up in heaven doing that. It's because God is generous and giving and thoughtful of the needs of others and gracious and all of that. It's because of that. It's written into the law, do not steal. In other words, the law reflects the wonderful character of God. It's like a pen portrait of Him. And as you get into His law, you see Him and His greatness and His beauty. And guess what the Jewish religious people have got? They've got it in spades. Look, you can see it there again. Look at verse 18. If you know His will and approve of what is superior because you're instructed by the law, you know the way God wants you to live. If you are convinced that you're a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark. In other words, in God's law is a pattern for living that sets you on to joy and peace. If you're an instructor of the foolish, it's wisdom. If you're a teacher of infants, you've got the pattern for growing up in life. They had all of that. What a privilege for them and for others. And over time, they would simply boast in the fact they had it in their pocket. Was it a privilege? Oh yeah. But look at the words that are used there. Verse 17. Excuse me, that's not going to come out very well on the recording. If you rely on that, in other words, you're relying on the law, as in the fact that you've got it. You brag, literally in the original, that sort of boast or glory in. It's the thing that gives you confidence before God, just because you've got it in your pocket. But here's their mistake. They confused having the law with keeping it. They were high in principle, but very low in performance. You can see that here in verses 21 through to 23. Paul just knocks off a few things that they know, but they don't do. You then, who teach others, do you not teach yourself? In other words, you're yelling at everybody else how to live. Take a look in the mirror, mate. You preach against stealing. Do you steal? Oh, they were stealing left, right, and centre. You say that people should not commit adultery. Do you commit adultery? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And it's the same, not just with the Jewish people, but on through religious culture. So history records so powerfully that one of the reasons people went into monasteries was to escape the corruption and the brokenness of the world. But history reports that it was just as bad within the monastery as it was without. Again and again it's documented. What does it teach us? That actually the problem's in here. It's not out there. The problem's in here. So there's this massive gap. It is one thing to own it. It is another to take the law as God intended and to take it into your heart. There's a huge gap between principle and performance. And their privilege of having it blinded them to their own failure and own inability to keep it. And it is no different today. How many times do you get the charge spoken at you that I don't want to go to church because it is full of hypocrites? Hypocrites literally means play actors. They're saying one thing about themselves and living a totally different way. Thank you, Fiona, for being honest. Wasn't that refreshing? That I want to live a different way, but actually if you look at me, you don't see that I'm actually that different because I feel a pull to all those other things as well. I want to look more different, but I struggle to do it all on my own. And the greatest example of the church hypocrites, well, this is what he says. I'm a churchgoer, don't you know? And what was his name? Judas. It's stark, that, isn't it? So simply, what is the message there of this part? Well, being in church no more makes you a Christian and safe from God's judgment than being in a garage makes you a car. Or going to Mackey's makes you a Big Mac and large fries. It doesn't help in and of itself. Look at verse 24. You can see it's shocking here, isn't it? This was written by the prophet Isaiah. God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people, the people who they were supposed to show off God's riches, glory and grace to. God's name is blasphemed, dragged through the mud among the Gentiles because of you. Listen, religious person, you're giving God a bad name. If ever people look at us and say, well, if that's what a Christian is, I want nothing more to do with it, then we're in a bad state, aren't we? Do you think that knowing about God, from his law, from his word, protects us if we don't live it? It doesn't, does it? It actually makes us more guilty. We've got less to shelter under rather than more. So you can have a Bible on your shelf, or even have it sitting on your laps, and it should be no comfort to you if it's not something that you live out in all its fullness. And yet we can't live it out in all its fullness. We fail miserably. What hope have we got? We've got no hope. If you're a parent here, you should feel this. I mean, this is particularly for people who teach God's word, which is me. And I look at myself and I tremble. What hope have I got? But if you're a parent, maybe you read the Bible with your kids regularly, which is what you should do, which is a great thing to do as a parent. You're reading 1 minute and you're saying, do this, 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 and this, and this is what it looks like to follow the Christian life. And then the rest of the day, your kids are getting a real lesson, aren't they? And they're seeing what you really live for and what you really set your heart on. What's it say in verse 24? God's name is blasphemed amongst our children because of us. It's frightening, isn't it? I don't think it would be too alarmist simply to say that we've failed miserably and we are doomed, because merely knowing about God won't help anybody. It just won't. If that's the first thing, what about the second reason Paul brings out of these verses as to why religion cannot shelter us from God's anger? Well, it's merely an outward sign won't help you. A merely outward sign won't help you. What is it I've got on my finger here? Not just any ring, eh? You should have said cheap ring, but yeah, you'd have been right. How much did it cost me? Was it £9? It's brilliant. That's how much we put. Yeah, it's only an outward sign, though. Cheapest wedding ring we could find because we had no money. We were absolutely skint. Yeah, I bought my wedding ring, didn't I? Whatever. Anyway, okay, we were that poor. But this is merely an outward sign. Okay, it is an outward sign that is supposed to point to an inward commitment. Agreed? That's what a wedding ring's about. But I could have 100, 200, the most expensive wedding ring in the world, but if I don't have an inward commitment to my wife, I don't have much of a marriage, do I? Now, if that makes sense with a wedding ring, God knows the difference between you taking on an outward sign and really being committed to him in your heart. God gave the Jewish people an outward sign. We can see it here in verse 25. Circumcision has value if you observe the law, but if you break the law, you have become as though you had not been circumcised. If those who are circumcised keep the law's requirements, will they not be regarded as those who were circumcised? The one who is not circumcised physically, yet obeys the law, will condemn you, who, even though you have the written code and circumcision, are a lawbreaker. A man is not a Jew if he is only one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a man is a Jew if he is one inwardly, and circumcision is circumcision of the heart by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a man's praise is not from men, but from God. So God gives the Jewish people an outward sign, circumcision. And you say, that's a bit weird, isn't it? Couldn't he have given them a wedding ring or something like that? Well, can I tell you that the mark of circumcision was of great value? Back in those days, when you made a covenant agreement, a deal, like a marriage thing, the sign often involved showing what the consequences were if you broke it. So there's one instance in the Bible where God gets Abraham to cut an animal in two, puts one piece on one side, one piece on the other, and God himself walks through between the two pieces. And they are the covenant signs, as if he's saying, if I break my side of the deal to bring salvation to all the earth through you, then this is what must happen to me. I'll be cut in two. Now, I don't want you to dwell too long on this, but the sign of circumcision, within it, is the covenant sanction. If you do not keep your end of the deal, you will be cut off. So the covenant sign was there to remind God's people that they were in a wonderful deal. They had been called by grace to have a relationship with the living God, not through what they had earned or deserved, but because he is that kind of God. He promised to be faithful. I take you sinners I take you Jewish people to love, to cherish, to hold, till death us do part. I will give you that. And within the covenant sign, there was the warning of what it looked like to be unfaithful to God and not give him your full heart. Now, that was all part of his law, by the way. That was tied up within the law. But if you had no commitment, inner commitment to him, all it was the cutting away of a useless bit of flesh. That was all it was. Now please get this. As far as God is concerned, belonging to his people, being safe from the judgment, having his answer to the fact that he is angry with us, being safe in the judgment happens in the heart, not outwardly. And the religious person forgets that, don't they? They scratch around for outward things that they can grab a hold of that will help them feel safe and secure when we meet God face to face. Now the law was always about heart transformation. But the danger with reading God's law, as I said, is that you can forget that the law was given as a set of promises of what God is like and how to respond to him now in faith and what he will do for us in the future. What the Jewish people started to do was they would pick out of it, they would pick it and make it about external rules and regulations. So they would say, right, I haven't stolen, I haven't killed, I haven't slept with another man's wife, I'm okay with God. So it was all about the outward stuff there and trying to make it as a list that could be tick-offable. In fact, they'd go away even feeling safe. I'm a good Jew, don't you know? I've been circumcised, I've done all of these things, I feel safe and okay. But that wasn't what God was ever getting at with his law when he gave it to the nation of Israel. He was getting at them, because they're his people, knowing his grace, having a totally new kind of heart. Totally new type of heart. But what the Jews did, and what we often do, is use God's law to self-justify. So we'll look at the list here. I didn't kill. I'm all right with God. Now, it wasn't until the time of Jesus that this really became so plain and obvious. There were hints of what they were doing wrong all the way through the Old Testament. So the promise to the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah 31 was that a time is coming when I will give you a new heart and my laws will be written within your heart as they were always supposed to be. But it wasn't until Jesus came, and you think about the Sermon on the Mount, and he basically goes through the Ten Commandments and he shows what they really were supposed to point you to. So he says, you've heard that it says in the Ten Commandments, do not kill. But I say to you, if you say rakah to anybody, then you are guilty, as if a murderer. Then you've committed murder in your heart. Now to say rakah to somebody is basically to say, you nobody. So do you get what Jesus is saying? What does the law have in mind? Not just do not kill, but do not act in such a way towards somebody that it does anything other than cherish them as God does. Puts infinite value on them, makes them totally worth something. You treat them as kings and queens. To do anything less than that is to have the heart of a murderer. And the only reason that you do not murder is because the seed of murder within you hasn't had the restraints taken off and been watered. Within each one of us is the capability of that. And Jesus says this law is getting at a heart that says you're of total worth. And yet we satisfy with, I ain't killed nobody. And so the law of God exposes us. Anything less is a murderer. So verse 28, look what Jesus is getting at. A man is not a Jew if he is only one outwardly. You've had the snip, you've got the sign. Nor is circumcision, true circumcision, merely outward and physical. No, a man is a Jew if he is one inwardly. And we could go through all the other examples in the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus goes at. In terms of, not just don't be greedy, but be so generous that when you give away, you're happy to just give it away and you're not even bothered if they don't thank you. You just give them because, or when you're anxious about something, you're not anxious anymore because whatever it is you're facing, you are so confident that you've got God your Father with you that you just trust him for whatever he brings because you've got him and that's all that matters. That's the heart that the law was pushing towards. Do we get that? Brilliant. I need you to get that. That's what the law was pushing at. Not a mere outward sign with a little pair of scissors, snip, snip, snip. Not, just merely, do not kill. So that belonging to God happens in the heart, not outwardly. God is interested in an inner transformation. Now that sounds beautiful, doesn't it, in many ways? Because we like the idea that God doesn't judge by externals, but judges by looking inside. In fact, it says in the Bible, doesn't it? It says in the Old Testament that man looks on the outside, God looks on the heart. Now that sounds nice, and it is beautiful. But if your name is Steve Casey, or if you're somebody who sits in a pew at Speed Baptist Church, can I tell you it's terrible? Because I can change the outward. I can. But I'm powerless. Hold on, mate. I am powerless over what goes on in my heart. My heart runs away with me in a terrible way. If you lot saw what was going on inside of my heart half the time, I would never show up here again. And I'm not the only one, am I? So if God is looking on the heart, then we're all in big trouble. And a little snip isn't going to change that. Or the new covenant, the now Jesus has come version of that, which is baptism. How many people, when you try to talk to them about Jesus, say this? Because of the first communion, the idea that they need to be put right with God, you talk to them about the love of Jesus and they say, I'm a Catholic. I'm safe. I've been baptised. Steve baptised me in this pool, I'm safe. I'm in the clear. I'm all right. You see, you can fool the head teacher of the faith school when you put your application in to get your kids into there. You can fool them. You can put in your first communion certificate. You can put in the letter from the pastor because it's all outward. You cannot fool God. If outward submission, outward dunking in water would do it, all you and me would need to do is hire a fire engine, get me to pray over it, and ride down Central Avenue blasting everybody with water, and then they'll be saved. Do you think that will do it? God's not fooled. It's our heart. And unless you are standing and relying on Him, that is our only hope. So please, mere outward signs won't help a bit. I don't read the Bible. Oh, sorry, yeah, forget that bit. I do read the Bible. I'll ignore that bit. Let me sum up very quickly. Oh dear. Okay, I'm going to go back and say that. What I was going to say was that I got it totally out of context. My quote was this. I find that when I'm looking at this, it's not that I read the Bible, and I don't read the Bible, but the Bible reads me. Sounded better that time, didn't it? Forgive me. Let me sum up before I fall into the baptistry. The biggest threat that you and me face, apart from Alan's wrath in a minute for me going over time, the biggest threat that you and I face in life is not the recession, is not global warming, is not gangs of youths on the street, is not the rowdy neighbour next door, is not having to pay the rent, is not even a tumour that we may have to tackle. Our biggest thing that we face, the biggest thing hanging over us, is the fact that the God who made us and loved us is against us and offended at our making Him small, belittling Him as if He is nothing. It is God acting out the covenant curse of cutting us off. We are cut off from Him violently, from His presence now, and we feel it right now. And we are heading for a lost eternity of judgment, what the Bible calls living hell. And do you think that the burning purity of God's holiness, His justice, will be slowed down as it comes against us, even a tiny little bit, by holding the Bible in one hand and a baptism certificate in another? No. He won't even miss a beat. It won't get in His way. He may even laugh. Unless you are standing on, relying on, glorying in, hoping in, putting your confidence in what the Bible and the baptism certificate point to. Not them themselves, what they point to. Not my ability to know enough of the law and keep it, but Jesus' ultimate ability to keep the law to be the true embodiment of the law. Can you think of anybody else who's had a pulse in their body, who has actually treated everybody else as kings and queens, even if it cost them everything? Can you think of anybody else who has totally put himself in God the Father's hands? Jesus kept the full law. In fact, when you read the law now, you say, that's Jesus. He can be my hope. Jesus is the one who, despite never missing a beat in the law, never stealing, never damaging others, never blaspheming God, always treating them well, never treating them as nothing. He was the only one who ever did it, but he was cut off violently, in a bloody and ugly manner. He was excluded at the cross. Do you remember what he cried out? My God, why have you forsaken me? He was cut off from the presence of God. I can't see you, I can't feel you. He was the only one who'd ever kept the Father's heart. And he got distance from the Father's heart. He was cut off from the land of the living. He took on himself the wrath that we deserve. He was getting the covenant curse we deserve for not keeping the law. So you cannot shelter under a Bible and a certificate, but you can shelter under the cross that is spoken of in the Bible and acted out, an outward sign of, in baptism. And as you start to do that, suddenly the law that before, get that away from me. I can't keep it, I don't measure up. It almost tyrannizes. What that law before, we either said get it away from me, or we minimized it and turned it into doable little things that we can do. Suddenly it becomes a delight. And we look in that law and we see Jesus because it points us to him. It pricks our hearts, we love him, and we suddenly start to love his law. We start to love all that he says to us about what it really means to live. So let me ask you, where does your confidence stand? Where is your heart now? What are you relying on? What is your confidence as you stand before God now and will do in the future? What are you using as your bouquet? If it's anything less than Jesus, it won't work. If it is anything other than Jesus, what you need to do now is transfer your confidence from whatever it is you're holding up and transfer your confidence to him and trust him as your Lord and King. Put your hope in his finished work for you. And that is why this is a gospel we don't need to be ashamed of, because it has the only answer for all of humanity.